A nurse kissed the unconscious billionaire, saying, "I've loved you for 20 years," thinking he'd never know, but he heard everything. My beautiful family, on your request, I am bringing a great love story. I promise this will be the best story of your life until today, pure, passionate, and unforgettable. Every chapter will touch your heart, and when chapter 10 arrives, it will surprise you in a way you'll never forget. Don't miss a single second, because every moment is written with true love. Hi, my beautiful family, I am Mr. Peter, always here with you in love. Heavenly Father, I thank you for blessing me with this family across the world. Bless every sister, mother, and daughter who listens with a pure heart. May their days be filled with peace, their nights with rest, and their homes with endless love. Lift their burdens, heal their pains, and let them know they are more precious than gold. Amen. And in this journey, my biggest strength has been Binta. She transformed me with her love, her wisdom, and her patience. She is the reason I stand strong, the reason I continue to create with passion, and the reason I never give up on my family. If your heart is true, right, present, if your love is real, right, I am with Mr. Peter. Don't forget to like and comment. Let's start with love. In the innocence of childhood, love blooms in its purest form, untainted by the world's complexities, unmarked by time's cruel lessons. The autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Roosevelt Elementary School, casting golden squares across the worn wooden floors of Mrs. Henderson's fourth-grade classroom. 9-year-old Barbara Williams sat in the third row, her dark curls catching the light as she carefully copied spelling words into her notebook. Her brown eyes would occasionally drift to the boy sitting beside her, Jensen Peterfy, with his sandy hair that never seemed to stay combed and eyes the color of summer sky. "Barbara," Jensen whispered, sliding a folded piece of paper across their shared desk. "Look what I drew for you." She unfolded the paper to find a crayon drawing of two stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with Jensen plus Barbara equals best friends forever, written in his careful 9-year-old handwriting. A smile bloomed across her face like sunshine breaking through clouds. "It's beautiful," she whispered back, her heart fluttering in that peculiar way that made her stomach feel like it was full of butterflies. "I'll keep it always." Their friendship had blossomed from the very first day of school, when Jensen had noticed Barbara sitting alone at lunch, her sandwich untouched because she was too shy to eat in front of the other children. Without hesitation, he had abandoned his table of rowdy boys and plopped down beside her. "Want to share my cookies?" he had asked, his gap-toothed smile so genuine that Barbara's shyness melted away like ice cream in summer. "My mom makes the best chocolate chip cookies in the whole world." From that moment, they were inseparable. They shared everything, lunches, secrets, dreams, and the innocent love that only children can feel with such pure intensity. Jensen would save her the best parts of his meals, and Barbara would help him with his reading assignments. They built elaborate castles in the sandbox during recess, created secret codes only they could understand, and made pinky promises about their future together. "When we grow up," Jensen had declared one afternoon while they sat under the old oak tree in the schoolyard, "I'm going to marry you, Barbara Williams. We'll live in a big house with a white picket fence and have the happiest life ever." Barbara had blushed pink as a spring rose. "Promise?" "Cross my heart and hope to die," Jensen had said solemnly, making an X over his chest. "You're going to be my wife forever and ever." Now, 3 months into the school year, their bond had only grown stronger. Jensen would walk Barbara home every day, carrying her books and picking wildflowers for her along the way. They would sit on her front porch steps, sharing ice pops and planning their weekend adventures, trips to the creek to catch minnows, expeditions to find 4-leaf clovers, or simply lying in the grass making pictures out of clouds. "Children, please turn to page 47 in your arithmetic books," Mrs. Henderson announced. her stern voice cutting through the comfortable murmur of the classroom. Jensen fumbled with his textbook, his mind still focused on the comic book hidden inside his desk rather than long division. Barbara noticed his distraction and gently tapped the correct page number on her own book, helping him catch up. Mr. Peterfy, Mrs. Henderson's sharp voice suddenly rang out, making several children jump. Perhaps you'd like to share with the class what's so fascinating about the inside of your desk. Jensen's face turned red as a fire truck. Mrs. Henderson was notorious for her strict discipline and had little patience for daydreaming students. She strode over to their row, her heels clicking ominously against the floor. "Stand up, young man," she commanded, towering over Jensen's desk like a storm cloud. "What do you have hidden in there?" Jensen's hands trembled as he slowly stood, knowing the comic book would mean detention, a note home to his parents, and possibly suspension from the upcoming field trip that he and Barbara had been eagerly anticipating for weeks. Barbara's heart raced as she watched her best friend's face crumple with fear and embarrassment. She couldn't bear to see him suffer, especially when she knew how much his parents' approval meant to him. His father, Thomas, was already putting pressure on Jensen to excel in school, preparing him for the family business empire that seemed to grow larger every month. Without thinking, Barbara shot to her feet, her small voice ringing clear and strong across the silent classroom. "It was me, Mrs. Henderson. The comic book is mine." Every head turned to stare at her. Jensen's mouth fell open in shock, his blue eyes wide with disbelief and gratitude. Mrs. Henderson's stern gaze shifted from Jensen to Barbara, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "Miss Williams," the teacher said slowly, "are you telling me that you were the one disrupting my class?" Barbara's knees knocked together beneath her plaid skirt, but she lifted her chin bravely. "Yes, ma'am. I was reading it during arithmetic. Jensen was just trying to get me to put it away." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but seeing the relief flood Jensen's face made every moment of upcoming punishment worthwhile. This was what love meant, protecting the person who mattered most, even when it cost you dearly. "I see," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone that all the students feared. "Miss Williams, you will stay after school for detention today, and you will write, 'I will not bring inappropriate reading material to class' 100 times. "Yes, ma'am," Barbara whispered, her voice barely audible. As Mrs. Henderson returned to the front of the classroom, Jensen reached over and squeezed Barbara's hand under their desk. The warmth of his palm against hers sent a shock of emotion through her small body, gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that she was too young to name, but old enough to feel. "Thank you," he mouthed silently, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Barbara squeezed his hand in return, her heart swelling with a love so pure and selfless that it seemed to fill the entire classroom with golden light. That afternoon, while Barbara sat in the empty classroom writing her lines, Jensen waited outside the school building despite his mother's driver honking impatiently. When she finally emerged, tired and with ink-stained fingers, he presented her with a bouquet of dandelions he had picked from the school lawn. "You're the bravest girl in the whole world," he said earnestly, "and the kindest, and the prettiest, and someday, when we're married, I'm going to spend every day making sure you never have to sacrifice anything for me again." Barbara smiled through her exhaustion, clutching the wilted dandelions like they were precious roses. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat, Jensen Peterfy. That's what people do when they love each other." They walked home hand in hand, their shadows stretching long across the sidewalk as the sun began to set. Neither child could have imagined that in just 3 short weeks, Jensen's father would burst through their front door with news that would change everything, news of a business opportunity in New York that was too good to pass up, news that would require an immediate move, news that would tear apart the most beautiful love story their small town had ever witnessed. For now, though, they were simply two children in love, walking home together as golden leaves danced around their feet, completely unaware that their perfect world was about to shatter into a million pieces. Chapter 2. 20 Years of Longing. Time may separate hearts, but true love remains eternal, waiting, hoping, never truly letting go. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital emergency room cast their harsh white glow over the bustling night shift, but Barbara Williams had long ago learned to find comfort in the controlled chaos of saving lives. At 29, she had spent 6 years as a registered nurse, her gentle hands and compassionate heart making her beloved among patients and colleagues alike. Her dark curls were now pinned back in a professional bun, and the shy little girl who once sat in Mrs. Henderson's classroom had blossomed into a confident woman whose beauty came not just from her warm brown eyes and radiant smile, but from the kindness that seemed to emanate from her very soul. "Barbara, we've got incoming," called Dr. Martinez from across the trauma bay. "Minor car accident, male victim, 29 years old, ETA 3 minutes. Barbara nodded, automatically checking her supplies and preparing the examination room. Years of nursing had taught her to focus on the medical needs first, but she couldn't help the small prayer she whispered for every patient who came through those doors, that their families wouldn't have to experience the devastating loss she'd witnessed too many times. The automatic doors whooshed open, and the paramedics wheeled in their patient. Barbara glanced up from her clipboard, ready to begin her assessment, when the world suddenly stopped spinning. Those eyes, those impossibly blue eyes that had haunted her dreams for 20 years. Jensen! The name escaped her lips in barely a whisper, her clipboard clattering to the floor. The man on the gurney turned his head toward her voice, and his face went completely white, despite the small cuts and bruises from the accident. "Barbara? Oh my God, Barbara, is it really you?" Time collapsed like a house of cards. 20 years vanished in an instant, and suddenly she was 9 years old again, standing in that 4th-grade classroom, willing to take any punishment to protect the boy she loved. The boy who had grown into this man, taller now, his sandy hair slightly darker, his face bearing the refined features of adulthood, but those eyes, those beautiful blue eyes, were exactly the same. I need to check your injuries," she stammered, her professional training warring with the emotional earthquake happening in her chest. Her hands shook as she reached for her stethoscope. "Don't," Jensen said softly, catching her wrist with surprising gentleness for someone who'd just been in an accident. "Not yet. Please, just let me look at you for a moment. I've dreamed of this face for 20 years. The emergency room buzzed around them, but Barbara felt as though they were trapped in a bubble where only the two of them existed. She studied his face, the strong jawline, the tiny scar above his left eyebrow that was new, the way his hair still fell across his forehead exactly like it had when he was 9. He was devastatingly handsome. But more than that, he was unmistakably her Jensen. "You're real," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "All these years, I wondered if I'd imagined how perfect you were. But you're even more beautiful than I remembered." "Jensen, I have to," she began, but he was already sitting up on the gurney, ignoring the protest from Dr. Martinez across the room. "Barbara," he said her name like a prayer, like he was afraid she might disappear if he spoke too loudly. "I looked for you." God, I looked everywhere. Before she could respond, before her professional instincts could kick in, before she could remember where they were and what she was supposed to be doing, Jensen's hands cupped her face with infinite tenderness. His thumbs traced her cheekbones as if he were memorizing every detail. "I never stopped loving you," he whispered, and then his lips were on hers. The kiss was gentle at first, hesitant, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. But when Barbara's eyes fluttered closed and she leaned into him, 20 years of separation exploded into a supernova of longing and love. Her hands found their way to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palms, and she kissed him back with all the love she'd carried in her heart since childhood. It was their first kiss, and yet it felt like coming home. It was the culmination of every childhood dream, every whispered promise under the old oak tree, every night she'd stared at the stars and wondered where he was. In that moment, surrounded by the beeping of monitors and the controlled chaos of the ER, they were 9 years old again, sitting on her front porch, sharing ice pops and planning their forever. "Nurse Williams!" Dr. Martinez's sharp voice cut through their reunion like a knife. "I need you to focus here." Barbara jerked away from Jensen, her face burning with embarrassment and her heart racing like a hummingbird's wings. She was a professional, a respected nurse, and she'd just kissed a patient in the middle of the emergency room. "I'm sorry," she whispered, stepping back and trying to regain her composure. "I need to examine you properly. This is highly unprofessional of me." Jensen caught her hand as she reached for her discarded clipboard. "Barbara, don't apologize. Not for this. Never for this. But you thought I wasn't listening," he said gently, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, that same lopsided smile that had made her heart skip beats in 4th grade. "But I heard every word you said. You whispered my name when you saw me, and I heard everything your heart was saying." She looked at him in wonder. Even after all these years, he could still read her like an open book. "How did you know?" "Because mine was saying the same thing," he replied simply. "It's been saying the same thing for 20 years. Barbara, Barbara, Barbara. It's the only word my heart knows how to speak." With shaking hands, Barbara began her examination, checking his pupils for signs of concussion, gently probing the cut on his forehead, listening to his heart and lungs. Every touch was electric, every moment an exquisite torture of proximity and professional distance. "Tell me about the accident," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Rear-ended at a red light," Jensen replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "The other driver was texting. Minor whiplash, a few scrapes, nothing that won't heal." He paused, then added quietly, "I was driving through town, Barbara. I've done it twice before over the years, hoping to find you." Her hand stilled on his wrist where she was checking his pulse. "You came back? You looked for me." "Every few years, when the missing you became unbearable," he admitted. "I'd drive through the old neighborhood, past your house, past the school. But you were gone. Mrs. Patterson next door told me you'd left for nursing school right after high school. She didn't know where." Tears pricked at Barbara's eyes. All those years, while she was building her career and trying to convince herself she'd moved on, he'd been searching for her. "I went to nursing school in Chicago," she whispered. "Then I came here to St. Mary's 6 years ago. I never went back home either. Too many memories." "Of us?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Jensen's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the same natural ease they'd shared as children. "I have something to confess," he said softly. "The accident tonight? I wasn't paying attention because I was thinking about you. I was driving past our old elementary school, remembering the day you took detention for me, and I couldn't focus on anything else." A tear escaped down Barbara's cheek. "You remember that?" "I remember everything," he said fiercely. "Every shared lunch, every note you passed me, every time you held my hand. I remember the way you smelled like strawberry shampoo and the sound of your laugh when I told you silly jokes. I remember the day you said you'd marry me under the oak tree, and I remember—" His voice broke slightly. "I remember the day my father told me we were moving to New York." The pain in his voice transported Barbara back to that horrible afternoon 20 years ago. She'd been waiting for Jensen on her front porch, excited to show him the valentine she'd made for him, when his mother's car had pulled up and a red-eyed Jensen had run to her, sobbing. 3 days, she whispered, remembering. Your father gave you 3 days to pack. The longest 3 days of my life, Jensen agreed. Until tonight. I thought I'd lost you forever, Barbara. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life wondering, what if? Doctor. Martinez approached their station, and Barbara quickly stepped back, trying to compose herself, but her heart was singing, soaring, breaking and healing all at the same time. How's our patient, Nurse Williams? Dr. Martinez asked, eyeing them both curiously. Minor injuries, all superficial, Barbara reported professionally. No signs of concussion. He's cleared for discharge with standard instructions for potential whiplash. Excellent. Mr. Peterfee, you're free to go home. Dr. Martinez scribbled on his chart and moved on to the next patient. Jensen sat up slowly, his eyes never leaving Barbara's face. My shift ends in an hour, she said quietly, hardly daring to hope. I'll wait, he said immediately. I've waited 20 years. I can wait another hour. As he slipped off the examination table, preparing to leave, Jensen turned back to her one final time. Barbara? Yes. That little girl who took detention for me all those years ago? She grew up to be the most incredible woman I've ever known. He started to walk away, then paused at the curtain. I'll be in the waiting room. And Barbara? This time I'm not going anywhere without you. As the curtain swished closed behind him, Barbara pressed her hand to her racing heart, wondering if it was possible to die from pure joy. Because after 20 years of missing him, 20 years of wondering what could have been, her childhood sweetheart was back, and he still loved her. Chapter 3. Reunion and Revelation. Some loves are written in the stars, destined to find their way back to each other despite time, distance, and every obstacle the world can create. The hospital cafeteria at midnight was a lonely place, filled only with the hum of vending machines and the occasional shuffle of exhausted medical staff grabbing coffee between emergencies. Barbara sat across from Jensen at a small corner table, still hardly believing he was real. She had changed out of her scrubs into jeans and a soft blue sweater, her hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. Jensen couldn't stop staring at her. Every few seconds, his hand would reach across the table to touch hers, as if he needed the physical contact to convince himself this wasn't just another dream. Tell me everything, he said softly, his fingers tracing patterns on the back of her hand. 20 years, Barbara. I want to know every single day. She laughed, and the sound was like music he'd forgotten he'd been missing. 20 years is a lot of days, Jensen Peterfee. Where do I even start? Start with the day after I left, he said quietly. I used to imagine what you did that first morning when you realized I was really gone. Barbara's smile faltered slightly. I waited on the porch, she whispered, for 3 hours. I kept thinking you'd come running around the corner, telling me it was all a mistake. Jensen's heart clenched. Barbara, when my mother finally came to get me for lunch, I cried for 2 days straight. Barbara's voice was soft with memory. I kept your drawing, the one with the stick figures under the rainbow. I carried it in my backpack all through school, through nursing college, even now. It's in my purse. You still have it. Jensen's voice was barely a whisper. She nodded, fishing through her purse to pull out a worn, carefully folded piece of paper. The crayon colors had faded, and the edges were soft from years of handling, but the childish drawing was still clear, 2 stick figures holding hands under a bright rainbow. Jensen took the paper with reverent hands, his vision blurring with tears. You kept it all these years? It was all I had left of you, she said simply. On the worst days, when everything felt impossible, I'd look at it and remember what it felt like to be loved that purely. I can't believe you kept faith in us when I gave up so many times. I never gave up, Barbara said firmly. Disappointed, heartbroken, sometimes angry, yes, but never gave up. Something deep inside me always believed that true love finds a way. Jensen lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Tell me about nursing school. Barbara's face lit up with pride and passion. Northwestern in Chicago, scholarship student, worked 2 jobs to pay for everything else. It was hard, but I loved every minute. There's something magical about healing people, about being there during the most vulnerable moments of their lives. You were always meant to be a healer, Jensen said with certainty. Even as a child, you took care of everyone around you. And what about you? Barbara asked. Tell me about New York. Jensen's expression grew complicated, shadows passing across his features. Harvard Business School, then straight into the family empire. Peterfee Industries, real estate development, commercial properties, luxury hotels. My father had very specific plans for my life. College, business, marriage to the right kind of woman from the right kind of family. Marriage? The word hit Barbara like a physical blow, and she pulled her hands away. You're married? No, Jensen said quickly, reaching for her hands again. God, no. I've never been married, Barbara, never even close. The relief that flooded through her was so intense it left her dizzy. But you said marriage plans. My father's plans, not mine, Jensen clarified. He's been trying to arrange something with the daughter of his business partner for months, but I could never. How could I marry someone else when my heart has belonged to you since I was 9 years old? Barbara's eyes filled with tears. But Jensen, that's 20 years of loneliness. 20 years of waiting, he corrected gently. Oh, I dated. I tried to move on, tried to convince myself that what we had was just childhood fantasy. But every woman I met I compared to a 9-year-old girl with dark curls and kind eyes. None of them ever measured up. I know exactly what you mean, Barbara whispered. I dated too, even got engaged once during nursing school, but I could never love anyone the way I loved you. You were engaged. Now it was Jensen's turn to feel jealous. For 6 months, David was a wonderful man, kind, smart, wanted to save the world through medicine, but when he kissed me, she shook her head. All I could think about was a 9-year-old boy with messy hair and blue eyes who promised to marry me under an oak tree. Jensen smiled at that, remembering their childhood promises with perfect clarity. I kept that promise, you know, never made it to anyone else. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, fingers intertwined, both marveling at how perfectly they still fit together after all these years. What are you thinking? He asked, catching her staring. I'm thinking about time, she said slowly. How strange it is. 20 years feels like forever, and also like no time at all. You're different, older, more sophisticated, but you're still madly in love with you. She blushed, and Jensen marveled at how that shy pink flush was exactly the same as when they were children. Still the boy who saved dandelions for me, she said softly. And you're still the girl brave enough to sacrifice herself for love, Jensen replied. Still the most beautiful soul I've ever known. He glanced at his watch and frowned. It's almost 1 in the morning. I should get you home. Where are you staying? Barbara asked as they stood to leave. The Marriott downtown. I drove down from New York for a business meeting, but after this, he gestured between them. I think I'm going to have to reschedule. They walked out to the parking garage together, neither wanting to separate. Barbara's small Honda Civic looked humble next to Jensen's sleek BMW, but he didn't seem to notice the difference. Follow me home? Barbara asked, her heart racing at her own boldness. Just to talk more. I have coffee and 20 years of questions, and I'm not ready to say goodnight. Jensen's face lit up like sunrise. I would love nothing more. Her apartment was small, a one-bedroom in a converted Victorian house, furnished with pieces she'd collected from thrift stores and garage sales. But she'd made it beautiful with soft fabrics, warm lighting, and dozens of plants. It's perfect, Jensen said as he looked around, and she could tell he meant it. It feels like you. Warm and welcoming and full of life. Barbara busied herself making coffee, hyper-aware of Jensen's presence as he studied the photographs on her refrigerator. Pictures of her nursing school graduation, her colleagues at the hospital, her adopted stray cat who had passed away the previous year. You always did love strays, Jensen said fondly. Some things never change, Barbara agreed, handing him a mug of coffee. They settled on her small sofa, close enough to touch, but not quite touching. Barbara, Jensen said seriously, setting down his mug, I need you to know something. Tonight, finding you again. It's not just coincidence. I believe it's fate. What do you mean? I've been coming back here every few years. Tonight was the third time. I tell myself it's business, but really, he ran his hands through his hair. Really, I'm always looking for you. And tonight, when I got in that accident, literally 2 blocks from the hospital where you work, that can't be random. Barbara felt tears threatening again. Do you really believe that? That we were meant to find each other? I believe that some loves are bigger than time or distance or family obligations, Jensen said firmly. I believe that what we had as children was real, and what I'm feeling right now is the continuation of that same love. Before she could lose her courage, Barbara leaned forward and kissed him. This time there was no hospital setting, no professional obligations, no interruptions. This time it was just them, 2 souls who had loved each other since childhood, finally free to express everything they'd held back for 2 decades. The kiss deepened naturally, 20 years of longing pouring out in gentle touches and whispered endearments. Jensen's hands tangled in her hair, and Barbara marveled at how perfectly she still fit against him. I love you, Jensen whispered against her lips. I've loved you for 20 years, and I'll love you for 20 more. I love you too, Barbara replied, tears of joy streaming down her face. I never stopped, not for a single day. They held each other on the small sofa as the night deepened around them, talking in whispers about their separate journeys, their shared memories, their hope for a future together. At some point, Barbara fell asleep in Jensen's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Jensen stayed awake longer, stroking her hair and marveling at the miracle of holding her again. Tomorrow, he would have to face reality, his father's expectations, the business obligations waiting in New York, the complicated logistics of 2 lives that had grown in different directions. But tonight, in this small apartment that felt more like home than any mansion ever had, he was exactly where he belonged. As dawn began to lighten the windows, Jensen finally allowed himself to sleep, still holding the woman who had owned his heart since he was 9 years old. Neither of them could have imagined that less than 12 hours later, their newfound happiness would face its greatest test when he walked through the doors of the Peterfee family mansion with Barbara on his arm. Chapter 4. Meeting the family storm. When love collides with expectation, the heart must choose between duty and destiny. The Peterfee estate sprawled across 15 manicured acres in the most exclusive section of the city, its Gothic revival architecture commanding attention like a fortress built of privilege and power. As Jensen's BMW wound up the circular drive lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and imported Italian statuary, Barbara felt her confidence shrinking with each passing moment. The mansion loomed before them, its limestone facade and soaring towers making her small apartment seem like a dollhouse in comparison. "Second thoughts?" Jensen asked gently, noticing how her hands trembled as she smoothed her simple black dress, the nicest thing in her wardrobe, chosen carefully for this moment. "Maybe a few hundred," Barbara admitted, staring up at the imposing structure. "Jensen, this is your world. Look at this place. Look at me. I'm a nurse from a modest background who drives a 10-year-old Honda." Jensen pulled the car to a stop in front of the grand entrance, where massive oak doors waited beneath an elaborate stone archway. He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious and filled with determination. "This house is not my world, Barbara. You are my world. This place is just where I happen to grow up. But your family, my family is going to love you," Jensen said firmly, though Barbara caught the slight uncertainty in his voice. "They have to. Because I love you." Before Barbara could respond, the front doors swung open and a woman emerged onto the stone steps. Tall and elegant, with silver-streaked blonde hair perfectly coiffed and wearing a designer suit, Dorothy Peterfy moved with the grace of someone born to command attention. Her sharp blue eyes took in the scene with instant understanding and barely concealed alarm. "Jensen, darling," Dorothy called, her voice carrying cultured tones, "we weren't expecting you until this evening. And you've brought a guest." Jensen emerged from the car and moved to open Barbara's door, his movements confident despite the tension Barbara could see in his shoulders. "Mother, I'd like you to meet someone very special. This is Barbara Williams." Barbara stepped out on unsteady legs, immediately feeling underdressed, despite Jensen's reassuring presence beside her. Dorothy Peterfy was even more intimidating up close, beautiful in that polished, untouchable way that spoke of a lifetime of privilege. "Barbara," Dorothy repeated, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "How lovely to meet you. Are you one of Jensen's colleagues?" "No, ma'am," Barbara replied, accepting the handshake. "I'm a registered nurse. Jensen and we have history." Something flickered in Dorothy's eyes, recognition perhaps, or warning. Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the marble foyer, and two more figures appeared in the doorway. Thomas Peterfy was a man who commanded attention without effort. Tall and broad-shouldered despite his years, his silver hair impeccably styled, and his expensive suit tailored to perfection, he emanated the kind of power that came from controlling vast business empires. His eyes, a paler blue than his son's, swept over Barbara with calculating assessment. Behind him came Carolyn, Jensen's younger sister, who had inherited the family's striking features but softened them with her mother's elegance. At 26, she moved with confident grace, her dark hair swept into a sophisticated chignon. "Jensen," Thomas's voice boomed across the drive, warm with paternal affection that somehow managed to sound like a business greeting. "Son, you're early. The meeting with the Patterson Group isn't until 6. "I'm not here for business, Dad," Jensen replied, his arm moving protectively around Barbara's waist. "I'm here to introduce all of you to the woman I'm going to marry." The silence that followed was so complete that Barbara could hear the fountain in the center of the circular drive bubbling merrily away, completely oblivious to the tension crackling through the afternoon air. Dorothy's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Carolyn's mouth dropped open in shock. And Thomas? Thomas looked like a man who had just watched his carefully constructed empire begin to crumble. "I beg your pardon?" Thomas said slowly, his voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone. "You heard me correctly," Jensen replied, his voice steady despite the muscle ticking in his jaw. "Barbara and I are getting married." "Jensen, sweetheart," Dorothy interrupted, her voice taking on a soothing tone. "Perhaps we should all go inside and discuss this over tea. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." There's no misunderstanding, Mother. I love Barbara. I've loved her since I was 9 years old. Carolyn found her voice first, stepping forward with curiosity. 9 years old? Jensen, what are you talking about? Barbara felt heat rise in her cheeks as all eyes turned to her. We knew each other as children, she explained quietly, before your family moved to New York. Before we moved? Dorothy's eyes widened in recognition. Oh my God, you're the little girl from elementary school, the one Jensen cried about for months after we moved. The one he refused to stop talking about, Thomas added grimly, his businesslike demeanor cracking to reveal something that looked disturbingly like panic. The one he claimed he was going to marry when he grew up. And now I am grown up, Jensen said firmly, and I'm keeping that promise. Thomas's face was turning an alarming shade of red. Jensen Michael Peterfy, Thomas said through gritted teeth, you will do no such thing. You have responsibilities, obligations. The Patterson merger depends on your engagement to Miranda. Then the Patterson merger will have to fail, Jensen replied with a calmness that Barbara found both admirable and terrifying. Are you out of your mind? Thomas roared, his composure finally snapping completely. Do you have any idea what you're saying? This merger represents everything I've worked for. And what about what I've worked for? Jensen shot back, his own temper finally flaring. What about my happiness? What about love? Love. Thomas spat the word like it tasted bitter. Love doesn't pay for the lifestyle you've grown accustomed to, son. Love doesn't build business empires or secure family legacies. Barbara felt like she was watching a tennis match conducted with emotional grenades. Carolyn stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock, while Dorothy wrung her hands and looked like she might faint. Thomas, please, Dorothy said weakly. Perhaps we should... No, Thomas cut her off, his attention fixed on his son like a laser. Jensen, I forbid this. Do you hear me? I absolutely forbid it. You can't forbid me anything anymore, Dad, Jensen replied, his voice deadly quiet. I'm 29 years old, and I make my own decisions about my life. Not while you live under my roof and work for my company, Thomas shot back. Not while you benefit from the Peterfy name and fortune. The threat hung in the air like a sword, and Barbara felt her heart sink. She had known this moment would come, the moment when Jensen would have to choose between his family's wealth and their love. What exactly are you saying? Jensen asked, though Barbara could tell from his tone that he already knew. I'm saying that if you insist on throwing away your future for this fantasy. Thomas's gaze flicked dismissively over Barbara, making her feel smaller than an insect. Then you can do it without the benefit of family support, financial or otherwise. Thomas, Dorothy gasped, finally finding her voice. Surely you don't mean... I mean exactly what I said, Thomas replied coldly. Jensen, you have 24 hours to come to your senses. Either you end this foolishness and honor your commitment to Miranda Patterson, or you can consider yourself no longer a member of this family. The color drained from Jensen's face, but his arm around Barbara's waist never wavered. You would disown your own son? Over this? I would save my son from making the biggest mistake of his life, Thomas corrected. You think you love this woman? You barely know her. You knew a child 20 years ago. This woman is a stranger. That's not true, Barbara said quietly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. Her voice was soft but steady. I know it seems impossible to understand, but what Jensen and I had as children was real. It was love in its purest form, and it never died. Thomas turned his cold stare on her. Miss Williams, let me be very clear. My son is the heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire. He has responsibilities that go far beyond his personal desires. I understand that, Mr. Peterfy, Barbara replied, somehow managing to keep her voice level despite the humiliation burning through her. "But I also understand that your son is a human being with the right to choose his own happiness." "Happiness?" Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Young woman, happiness is a luxury that people in our position cannot afford. Jensen's marriage to Miranda Patterson will secure the future of thousands of employees and ensure the continued prosperity of this family. Can your love do any of that?" "It can do something more important," Barbara said, surprising herself with her courage. "It can make him truly happy. It can give his life meaning beyond money and power." "How noble," Thomas said sarcastically, "and how naive. Tell me, Miss Williams, what exactly can you offer my son? A nurse's salary, a modest apartment, a life of financial struggle?" Each word was like a physical blow, but Barbara forced herself to stand straight and meet his gaze. "I can offer him love, Mr. Peterfee, pure, unconditional love, the kind that doesn't depend on stock prices or business mergers." "Love doesn't pay bills," Thomas replied harshly. "Stop it," Jensen said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Both of you, just stop. Dad, I get it. You want me to marry Miranda, seal your business deal, and live happily ever after in a loveless marriage. But I won't do it." "Jensen," Dorothy began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "No, Mom. I've listened to these arguments my entire life. Do this for the family, sacrifice that for the business. Well, I'm done sacrificing. I found the woman I love and I'm not losing her again." Thomas's face was stone. "Then you've made your choice." "Yes," Jensen said firmly. "I have." "Very well." Thomas straightened his tie with sharp, angry movements. "You have until tomorrow evening to collect your belongings. Your credit cards will be cancelled, your trust fund frozen, and your name removed from all family accounts." The cruelty of it took Barbara's breath away. This was Jensen's father, the man who had raised him, and he was willing to destroy his son's life rather than accept a love that didn't fit his business plans. "Thomas, please," Dorothy whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He's our son." "He was our son," Thomas corrected coldly. "Now he's made his choice. Dorothy, Carolyn, we're going inside. This conversation is over." As Thomas turned and stalked toward the house, Dorothy lingered for a moment, her eyes filled with anguish. "Jensen, please," she whispered, "please reconsider." "I understand perfectly, Mom," Jensen replied sadly. "I'm giving up a life without love, and I'm choosing a life with it instead." Carolyn approached them hesitantly, her face pale with shock. "Jensen, I don't understand any of this. Who is she? Really?" Jensen's arm tightened around Barbara protectively. "She's the love of my life, Carolyn. The only woman I've ever truly loved." As they walked back to the car, Barbara felt like her world was spinning out of control. In 30 minutes, she had seen the man she loved lose everything because of his feelings for her. "Jensen," she whispered as he opened the car door for her, "what have we done?" But as they drove away from the mansion, Jensen reached over and took her hand, his fingers strong and warm and absolutely certain. "We've chosen love, Barbara, and that's never the wrong choice, no matter what it costs." Behind them, the Peterfee mansion grew smaller in the distance, but the magnitude of what lay ahead seemed to grow larger with every mile they traveled away from the only life Jensen had ever known. Chapter 5. The Ultimatum. In the crucible of impossible choices, true character reveals itself, not in what we gain, but in what we're willing to sacrifice for love. The silence in Barbara's small apartment felt heavier than the tension that had filled the Peterfee mansion just hours earlier. Jensen sat on her modest sofa, his head in his hands, while Barbara moved restlessly around the tiny kitchen, making tea neither of them would drink. The contrast between the opulent world they had just left and the humble sanctuary she called home had never seemed more stark. 24 hours, Jensen said quietly, his voice muffled by his palms. He gave me 24 hours to choose between everything I've ever known and the woman I love. Barbara set down the kettle with trembling hands. Jensen, we need to talk about this rationally. What your father said about the business, about Miranda Patterson. I don't care about Miranda Patterson, Jensen interrupted, lifting his head to look at her with fierce determination. I don't care about the business merger or the family fortune or any of it. But I care, Barbara said softly, moving to sit beside him. I care because you're giving up your entire life for me. Your family, your career, your financial security, everything. Jensen reached for her hands, holding them with gentle strength. Barbara, listen to me. That life, that fortune, none of it has ever made me happy. Not for a single day. Do you know what the last 20 years have been like for me? She shook her head, afraid to speak. Empty, he said simply. Completely empty. I've had everything money could buy, the best education, luxury cars, expensive clothes, exotic vacations, and I felt nothing but this constant ache, this sense that something essential was missing. Jensen, I know what was missing, he continued, his thumbs tracing circles on her hands. It was you. It was love. Real love, the kind we had as children, the kind that makes everything else fade into background noise. Barbara felt tears threatening, but she forced herself to think practically. But what about your future? What about security? I make a decent living as a nurse, but it's nothing compared to what you're used to. Do you think I care about any of that? Jensen asked incredulously. Barbara, look around this apartment. Really look at it. She glanced around her small living space, seeing it through his eyes. The second-hand furniture she'd lovingly restored, the plants she'd nurtured into lush greenery, the photographs that made the space uniquely hers. This place has more warmth and real beauty than that mansion ever had, Jensen said earnestly. That house is like a museum, impressive, expensive, and completely soulless. But this feels like home. You say that now, Barbara whispered, but what about in 5 years, 10 years? When you're working some ordinary job for ordinary pay, when we can't afford the things you've always taken for granted. Jensen was quiet for a long moment, and Barbara's heart sank, thinking she had finally made him see reason. But when he spoke, his voice was stronger than ever. Do you remember what I told you the day we left? He asked. The last thing I said before my family took me away. Barbara closed her eyes, the memory rushing back with painful clarity. They had been standing on her front porch, both crying while his mother waited in the car. You said you'd find a way to come back to me, she whispered. I said I'd find a way to come back to you, Jensen agreed, and that when I did, we'd never be separated again. I meant it then, and I mean it now. I don't care if I have to start over completely. As long as I'm with you, I'll be the richest man alive. The tears Barbara had been holding back finally spilled over. But your family, your father looked at me like I was something disgusting. Your mother seemed nice, but she'll never accept me. My family will come around, Jensen said with more confidence than he felt. My mother already looked like she was wavering by the time we left. She remembers how miserable I was after we moved. And Carolyn, she's always been a romantic at heart. And your father? Jensen's jaw tightened. My father is a businessman first and a father second. He always has been. But even he will eventually realize that having a son who's genuinely happy is worth more than any merger. Barbara wanted to believe him, but the memory of Thomas Peterfy's cold fury was too fresh. Jensen, you heard what he said. He'll cut you off completely. No family money, no trust fund, no job at the company. I'll be starting from love, Jensen corrected. And that's everything. Before Barbara could respond, her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "It's the hospital. I'm not scheduled to work tonight." "Barbara Williams speaking," she answered, her professional tone automatic. "Barbara, it's Dr. Martinez. I know you're off tonight, but we've got a situation here. 3-car accident on the interstate. Multiple injuries coming in. Can you come in?" Barbara looked at Jensen, torn between duty and the desperate need to resolve their situation. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. "You have to go," Jensen said as she hung up. It wasn't a question. "I could call back, tell them I can't." "No." Jensen stood and helped her gather her things. "This is who you are, Barbara. You save people. It's one of the million reasons I love you." "But we haven't finished talking about—" "We have finished," Jensen said firmly, taking her face in his hands. "There's nothing left to discuss. I'm choosing you, Barbara. I'm choosing us. Tomorrow morning I'm going to call my father and tell him his ultimatum was unnecessary because I've already made my decision." "Jensen." He silenced her with a gentle kiss. "Go save lives, my love. I'll be here when you get back, and we'll start planning our future together." As Barbara drove to the hospital, her mind raced with love, fear, and guilty hope. Part of her wanted to beg Jensen to reconsider, to take the safe path. But a larger part couldn't bear the thought of him trapped in a loveless marriage, slowly dying inside while living the life someone else had chosen for him. Meanwhile, back at the Peterfee mansion, the family was in crisis. Dorothy sat in the living room, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while Carolyn paced anxiously, and Thomas stood at the window, staring out at the perfectly manicured grounds with the expression of a general watching his battle plans fall apart. "He's not going to change his mind," Dorothy said quietly. "I know our son, Thomas. When he sets his heart on something, he doesn't waver." "He's infatuated," Thomas replied curtly. "It will pass." "Like it passed for the last 20 years, Carolyn asked sarcastically. "Dad, I was only 6 when we moved, but I remember how Jensen cried for months. He never forgot her." "He was a child," Thomas snapped. "Children cry over lost toys too." "She's not a toy," Dorothy said softly. "I saw the way he looked at her, Thomas. The way she looked at him. That's real love." "Real love doesn't pay for real life," Thomas retorted. "Do you want to see our son struggling to make ends meet? Working some menial job?" "I want to see our son happy," Dorothy replied with quiet strength. "And he's never been happy, Thomas. Not once in 20 years. Successful, accomplished, dutiful, everything you wanted him to be. But happy? No." Thomas turned from the window, his face a mask of frustrated determination. "This conversation is pointless. Jensen will come to his senses when he realizes what he's actually giving up." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas felt a flicker of doubt. He remembered his own father's attempts to control his life, his own rebellion when he'd married Dorothy against his family's wishes. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he pushed the memory aside. Back at the hospital, Barbara worked through the night, her hands steady and professional as she treated accident victims, but her heart torn between hope and heartbreak. Every time she had a free moment, she thought about Jensen sitting in her small apartment, probably staring at his phone and debating whether to call his father. At 3 a.m, during a brief lull, she stepped outside for fresh air and found herself looking up at the stars. Somewhere out there was the same star she and Jensen had wished on as children. "Please," she whispered to the universe, "please let us find a way through this. Please let love be enough." She didn't know that, at that very moment, Jensen was standing on her small balcony, looking up at the same star and making the same wish. He had spent the hours since she left thinking about their situation from every angle, weighing the costs and benefits, like the businessman his father had trained him to be. The math was simple. Giving up his family fortune meant hardship, struggle, and uncertainty. Keeping it meant wealth, security, and a lifetime of regret. For Jensen, it wasn't even close to a difficult choice. When Barbara finally returned home as dawn was breaking, she found Jensen in the kitchen making coffee, still wearing the expensive suit from their dinner, but looking more at peace than she'd seen him since their reunion. "How did it go?" he asked, wrapping her in his arms. "We saved 3 lives," she said, exhaustion and satisfaction warring in her voice. "And you? Have you?" "I've made my decision," Jensen said, kissing the top of her head. "Actually, I made it 20 years ago when I promised to marry you under an oak tree. I just needed last night to remember that some promises are more important than family expectations." Barbara pulled back to look at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or regret. She found none. "Are you absolutely certain?" she asked. "Because once you make that call to your father, there's no going back." Jensen smiled, and it was the same smile that had made her heart flutter in 4th grade, full of mischief, determination, and absolute certainty. "Barbara Williams, will you marry me? Officially this time, not just in a childhood promise. Will you marry a man who has nothing to offer but his heart and his determination to build a life worthy of your love?" Through her tears, Barbara saw their future stretching ahead, uncertain, challenging but blazing with the kind of happiness she'd only dreamed of for 20 years. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." As Jensen spun her around the small kitchen, both of them laughing and crying at the same time, neither of them could have imagined how much their love was about to cost them, or how ultimately it would prove to be worth every sacrifice they'd have to make. Chapter 6. Choosing love over luxury. True wealth is not measured in dollars, but in moments, moments of laughter, of tenderness, of love, shared in the smallest of spaces. The morning sun streamed through the sheer curtains of Barbara's bedroom, casting golden patterns across the rumpled sheets where she and Jensen lay entwined. The night had been a revelation of passion and tenderness, 20 years of longing finally expressed in whispered endearments and gentle caresses. "Good morning, my almost wife," Jensen murmured, his voice husky with sleep and contentment. "Good morning, my soon-to-be husband," Barbara replied, lifting her head to meet his eyes. In the soft morning light, he looked younger somehow, the stress lines around his eyes smoothed away by happiness. They had made love with the desperate passion of 2 souls finally reunited, but also with the tender reverence of 2 people who understood the preciousness of what they had found again. Every touch had been a promise, every kiss a declaration that this time nothing would separate them. "No regrets?" Barbara asked softly, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Only one," Jensen said, rolling over to pin her gently beneath him. "That we wasted 20 years apart when we could have been waking up like this every morning." Before Barbara could respond, Jensen's phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand. They both stared at it, knowing that reality was calling, demanding acknowledgement of the choice they had made and the consequences that would follow. Jensen glanced at the caller ID and his expression grew serious. "It's my assistant at the company. I need to take this." "Jensen Peterfy," he answered, his voice automatically shifting into professional mode. "Mr. Peterfy," came the nervous voice of his assistant, Rebecca. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but your father asked me to call. He wants to see you in his office this morning at 10. Jensen checked the clock. 8:30. "Tell him I'll be there," Jensen said simply. "Sir? Is everything all right? There are rumors." "Rebecca, after today I won't be your boss anymore," Jensen said gently. "So let me give you one last piece of advice. Sometimes the rumors are true." After he hung up, Barbara sat up, pulling the sheet around herself. The final confrontation? The final confrontation, Jensen agreed. He's giving me one last chance to change my mind. Jensen leaned down and kissed her, pouring all his certainty and love into the gesture. And I'm going to tell him that I've never been more sure of anything in my life. An hour later, Jensen stood in the elevator of Peterfee Industries, watching the floors tick by as he rose to his father's corner office. He had dressed carefully for this moment. His best suit, his Harvard cufflinks, his Italian leather shoes, not out of vanity, but as armor for the battle ahead. Thomas Peterfee was waiting behind his massive mahogany desk, the city skyline spread out behind him like a kingdom he ruled. He didn't look up when Jensen entered, instead continuing to study a file with intense concentration. "Sit down, son," Thomas said without lifting his eyes from the documents. Jensen remained standing. "I'd rather not. This won't take long." Finally, Thomas looked up, his pale blue eyes assessing his son with cold calculation. "I trust you've had time to think about our conversation yesterday. To consider what you're throwing away." "I have," Jensen replied calmly, "and my answer hasn't changed." "I see." Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Then let me be very clear about what your decision means. As of this moment, you're no longer employed by Peterfee Industries. Your company credit cards have been cancelled, your access to all accounts frozen, and your apartment lease will not be renewed." Jensen felt each blow land, but his expression never wavered. "I understand." "Do you?" Thomas stood and moved to the window. "Do you understand that without the Peterfee name, you're just another Harvard MBA in an oversaturated market? Do you understand that she'll watch you struggle to find work? I understand that you have so little faith in the son you raised that you think I can't succeed without the family name," Jensen replied. "But I disagree." Thomas spun around, his composure finally cracking. "This is not about faith, Jensen. This is about reality. You have never lived in the real world, never had to worry about money or struggle for anything." "Her name is Barbara," Jensen said quietly. "And I'm not asking her to endure anything. I'm promising her that we'll build something beautiful together, even if we have to start from nothing." Jensen pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it on his father's desk. "Then I guess you'll want this back." Thomas looked at the envelope suspiciously. "What is it?" "My resignation letter, and the keys to the BMW, and my credit cards, and the Rolex you gave me for graduation." Jensen's voice was steady, matter of fact. "I don't want anything that comes with strings attached." Thomas stared at the envelope as if it contained a live snake. "Jensen, for God's sake, think about what you're doing. Think about the life you could have with Miranda. She's beautiful, educated, from a good family." "She's not Barbara," Jensen interrupted, "and I don't love her." "Love fades," Thomas said desperately. "But financial security, family connections, a solid marriage based on mutual respect, those things last." "Like your marriage to Mom?" Jensen asked quietly. The question hit its mark. Thomas's face went pale, and for a moment, the powerful businessman looked like nothing more than a tired, aging man. "Your mother and I, that's different." "Is it?" "Because from what I remember, Grandpa Peterfee wasn't exactly thrilled when you married a senator's daughter instead of banking royalty. Didn't he threaten to cut you off too?" Thomas's jaw worked silently before he found his voice. "That was completely different. Your mother came from a prominent political family." "She had what you needed for your business goals," Jensen corrected. "But that's not why you married her, is it, Dad? You married her because you loved her, because you couldn't imagine living without her." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost vulnerable. Your mother almost left me 3 times in the first 5 years of our marriage. Do you know why?" Jensen frowned. He had never heard this story before. "Because love wasn't enough," Thomas continued. "We were broke, Jensen. Completely broke. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that was smaller than your current bathroom. Your mother worked as a secretary to pay for groceries while I chased one failed deal after another." Jensen felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "But you made it work." "Barely," Thomas admitted. "And only because I was lucky enough to catch a break with the Morrison development. Your mother would have left me, and rightly so." "But she didn't leave," Jensen pointed out. "No," Thomas said quietly. "She didn't. But I never want to see you put the woman you love through that kind of hardship." For the first time since entering the office, Jensen felt his certainty waver. "Dad, I'm not the villain here, son," Thomas said. "I'm trying to protect you from making the same mistakes I made." Jensen was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information. But then he thought about Barbara, about the strength she had shown, about the courage she had displayed when facing his family's disapproval. "The difference is," Jensen said finally, "Barbara isn't Mom. She's been supporting herself for years, building a career she loves. She doesn't need me to provide for her. She needs me to love her." "And when that love isn't enough to pay the bills," Thomas asked. "Then we'll figure it out together," Jensen said with quiet conviction. "Because that's what people do when they really love each other." Thomas stared at his son for a long moment, seeing something in Jensen's face that reminded him painfully of his own younger self. "You're going to do this," Thomas said finally. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to do this." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Then I wish you luck, son. You're going to need it." Jensen turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "Dad?" "Yes?" "When you and Mom were struggling in that 1-bedroom apartment, were you happy?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Jensen wondered if he was going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Happiest I've ever been in my life." Jensen smiled sadly. "Then you understand." When Jensen returned to Barbara's apartment, he found her pacing nervously in the living room. She turned when she heard his key, her eyes searching his face. "It's done," he said simply, pulling her into his arms. "I'm officially unemployed, broke and disowned." Barbara felt her heart break for him even as it soared with love and pride. "Jensen, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," he interrupted, spinning her around the small room. "I feel lighter than I have in 20 years, free, like I can finally breathe again." "But what are we going to do?" Barbara asked as he set her down. "About money, about work, about—" Jensen silenced her with a kiss that tasted of hope and determination. "We're going to do what people in love have been doing for centuries," he said against her lips. "We're going to figure it out as we go." That afternoon, they walked hand in hand through the city, talking and planning like the children they had once been, full of dreams and confidence that love could conquer any obstacle. Jensen marveled at how different the world looked when you weren't viewing it through the lens of family expectations and business obligations. "Look," Barbara said, stopping in front of a small cafe with a "Help Wanted" sign in the window. "Maybe this is where it starts." Jensen stared at the modest restaurant with its checkered tablecloths and handwritten menu, trying to imagine himself waiting tables or washing dishes. 6 months ago, the idea would have horrified him. Now, it represented possibility. "A small apartment is more precious than a castle," he said, remembering his promise from their reunion night. "And an honest day's work is more valuable than inherited wealth." "Are you sure about this?" Barbara asked one more time, giving him a final chance to change his mind. "Really, truly sure." Jensen looked at her. This woman who had loved him since childhood, who had kept his drawing for 20 years, who was willing to face an uncertain future with nothing but their love as security, and felt his heart overflow with certainty. "Barbara Williams," he said solemnly, taking her hands in his, "I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life. Rich or poor, struggle or success, I want to face it all with you." As they walked home together, the late afternoon sun painting everything golden around them, neither of them could have known that the real test of their love was just beginning, and that the choices they had made would lead them down a path more difficult than either had imagined. Chapter 7. The Struggle Begins. When love faces its first real trial, it either crumbles under pressure or emerges stronger, forged in the fire of shared hardship. 3 weeks had passed since Jensen walked out of his father's office, and the romantic glow of their reunion was beginning to dim under the harsh fluorescent lights of reality. Barbara sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of rejection letters, each one a polite but firm dismissal of Jensen's job applications. The pile seemed to grow larger every day, despite Jensen's tireless efforts to find employment. Harvard MBA, summa cum laude, 5 years of executive experience, Barbara read aloud from Jensen's latest rejection letter. "We regret to inform you that we have decided to pursue other candidates whose qualifications better match our current needs." Jensen emerged from the bathroom, freshly shaved and wearing his best suit, one of only 2 he had left after selling the rest to help with their mounting expenses. The confident businessman who had once commanded boardrooms now looked tired, the perpetual optimism that had carried him through the first weeks beginning to show cracks. "Let me guess," he said, nodding toward the letter. "Another, we'll keep your resume on file for future opportunities." "Morrison and Associates," Barbara confirmed, setting the letter on the growing pile. "That makes 15 this week." Jensen poured himself coffee, noting they were down to the generic brand Barbara bought at the discount store. 3 weeks ago, he wouldn't have noticed such details. Now, every penny mattered. "I have 3 more interviews today," he said, attempting confidence. "Hartwell Construction at 10, Summit Properties at 1, and Datatech Solutions at 4. Barbara looked up from the rejection letters, worry etched across her features. She had been working double shifts whenever possible, but even with her overtime pay, they were barely managing to cover rent and basic expenses. Her small savings account was dwindling rapidly. "Jensen," she said gently, "have you considered that maybe your father—" "My father has nothing to do with this," Jensen interrupted, but his tone lacked conviction. They both knew that Thomas Peterfy's influence in the business community extended far beyond his own company. A word from him could close doors that might otherwise be open. "Maybe you should try using a different name," Barbara suggested carefully. "Or not mentioning Peterfy Industries on your resume." Jensen's jaw tightened. "I'm not going to hide who I am or lie about my experience. If employers can't see past family politics, then they're not companies I want to work for anyway." Barbara admired his principles, but she was beginning to worry about their practical implications. She had grown up in a working-class family where pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. "What about the restaurant job?" she asked. "The manager at Mario's seemed interested yesterday." Jensen's expression darkened. "Waiting tables?" "It's honest work," Barbara said defensively, "and it would be immediate income while you continue looking." "I know it's honest work," Jensen replied, running his hands through his hair. "It's not about that. It's just, I never imagined—" He trailed off, but Barbara could fill in the blanks. He never imagined he would go from a corner office to carrying plates. "I'm sorry," Jensen said quickly, seeing the hurt in her eyes. "I didn't mean to sound like a snob. You're right. Work is work, and we need income." Barbara reached across the table and took his hand. We'll figure this out, Jensen. We just need time. Time and money, Jensen replied grimly, and we're running out of both. The first interview at Hartwell Construction was a disaster from the moment Jensen walked into the reception area. The secretary looked him up and down as if he were wearing a neon sign advertising his privileged background. "Mr. Peterfy," she said, making his name sound like an accusation. "Mr. Hartwell will see you now." Richard Hartwell was a self-made man who had built his construction company from a single crew into one of the region's largest contractors. His office walls were covered with photos of building sites and industry awards. He stood when Jensen entered, but his handshake was perfunctory. "So," Hartwell said, settling behind his cluttered desk, "Thomas Peterfy's boy wants to work construction." Jensen felt his heart sink. "I'm interested in project management. My experience at Peterfy Industries involved overseeing multiple commercial developments." "Your experience at Daddy's company," Hartwell corrected with undisguised contempt. "Tell me, son, you ever swing a hammer? Ever pour concrete in 90-degree heat?" "I've managed projects from the executive level," Jensen replied carefully. "I understand construction timelines and budget constraints." Hartwell laughed without humor. "You understand numbers on a spreadsheet. That's not the same thing." "Then teach me," Jensen said, his pride warring with desperation. "Start me anywhere. I'm willing to learn." "Are you?" Hartwell leaned back, studying Jensen. "Word is, your daddy cut you off for shacking up with some nurse. That true?" Jensen's hands clenched into fists under the desk. "My personal life is not relevant to this position." "Everything's relevant when you're hiring someone," Hartwell replied. "How do I know you won't run back to Daddy the first time you break a nail?" "Because I won't," Jensen said firmly. "I'll be honest with you, Peterfy. I don't think you'd last a week in this business, but even if you would, I can't afford to take that chance. I've got a good relationship with your father's company. They've subcontracted work to me for years. I'm not about to jeopardize that." Jensen felt the familiar sting of his father's invisible hand closing another door. "I see. Nothing personal," Hartwell said, standing. "Just business." The interview at Summit Properties went slightly better, but the result was the same. A carefully worded explanation about cultural fit that Jensen now recognized as code for "we don't want to anger Thomas Peterfy." By the time he arrived at Datatech Solutions, Jensen's confidence was hanging by a thread. The company specialized in project management software for construction firms, theoretically a perfect match for his skill set. The hiring manager, Sandra Chen, was a sharp-eyed woman who had built her career on recognizing talent. "Interesting resume," she said, scanning the document. "Impressive track record at Peterfy Industries. But I have to ask, why are you looking to leave the family business?" Jensen had rehearsed this answer dozens of times, but it never got easier. "I'm looking for new challenges and the opportunity to build something on my own merits." "And your father is supportive of this decision?" Jensen hesitated for just a moment too long. "My father and I have different views on my career direction." Sandra's expression sharpened. "Mr. Peterfy, I'm going to be direct. I've heard rumors about your situation. Your father's influence in this industry is considerable, and several of our clients do business with Peterfy Industries." "It won't create problems," Jensen said desperately. "I'm qualified for this position, and I'll prove my value regardless of any external politics." Sandra studied him for a long moment, and Jensen thought he saw sympathy in her eyes. "I believe you would," she said finally, "but I can't take the risk. I'm sorry." As Jensen walked out of the Datatech building into the late afternoon heat, the weight of failure settled over him like a suffocating blanket. 3 interviews, 3 rejections. His father's influence was like an invisible wall, blocking every path to legitimate employment. He found himself walking aimlessly through the city, past restaurants where he couldn't afford to eat, past shops where he couldn't afford to buy anything, past the life he had once taken for granted. For the first time since making his choice, Jensen allowed himself to wonder if his father had been right. When he finally returned to the apartment, he found Barbara in the living room, still wearing her scrubs from her shift at the hospital. She looked exhausted, her usually bright eyes dulled with fatigue. She had been working 12-hour shifts whenever possible, trying to compensate for his lack of income. "How did it go?" she asked, though his expression probably told her everything. "The same," Jensen said heavily, sinking onto the couch beside her. 3 interviews, 3 rejections. I'm beginning to think my father has blacklisted me with every major employer in the city." Barbara leaned against him, and he could feel the tension in her shoulders. "Maybe it's time to consider other options." "Like what?" "Like Mario's restaurant. Like taking whatever work you can find while continuing to look for something in your field. Like swallowing your pride." Jensen knew she was right, but the thought of serving plates while his Harvard classmates climbed corporate ladders felt like a physical blow. "I never thought it would be this hard," he admitted quietly. "I know," Barbara said softly, "but Jensen, we can't keep going like this. I'm working 60-hour weeks, we're behind on rent, and we haven't bought groceries in 3 days." The guilt hit him like a punch to the stomach. While he had been nursing his wounded pride and clinging to his professional dignity, Barbara had been sacrificing her health and happiness to keep them afloat. She was living off coffee and whatever free food the hospital cafeteria provided to staff, working extra shifts until she could barely stand. "You're right," he said, pulling her closer. "Tomorrow, I'll take whatever job I can find. Waiting tables, stocking shelves, cleaning offices, whatever it takes." Barbara lifted her head to look at him, and he saw tears threatening in her eyes. "I hate that it's come to this. I hate that your father's influence is making things so difficult." "It's not your fault," Jensen said firmly. "None of this is your fault. I made this choice, and I don't regret it. But I do regret that my pride has made things harder for you than they needed to be." That night, as they lay in bed sharing a dinner of canned soup and crackers, the only food left in their small pantry, Jensen made a silent promise. Tomorrow, he would set aside his ego and take whatever work he could find. He would prove that love could survive anything, even if it meant starting over from the very bottom. What he didn't know was that across town, Thomas Peterfy was lying awake in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he had pushed his idealistic son too far. The business community was small and gossipy, and word of Jensen's unsuccessful job search had filtered back to him. Part of him felt vindicated. His son was learning the harsh realities of life without family support. But another part, a part he tried desperately to ignore, felt something that might have been regret. In her separate bedroom down the hall, Dorothy Peterfy was also awake, clutching a framed photo of Jensen's college graduation and remembering the bright, hopeful young man who had once told her he was going to change the world. She thought about the nurse who had looked at her son with such obvious love and wondered if Thomas's stubborn pride was going to cost them their son forever. The Peterfy family was learning that some victories came at too high a price, and that sometimes winning meant losing everything that really mattered. Meanwhile, in Barbara's small apartment, 2 people who had chosen love over security held each other close and tried to believe that their story would have a happy ending, even as the challenges ahead seemed more daunting than either had imagined possible. Chapter 8: Father's Heartbreak. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from what we gain, but from witnessing the consequences of our choices reflected in the pain of those we love most. 2 months had passed since Jensen walked away from the Peterfee empire, and the October morning air carried the crisp promise of winter's approach. Thomas Peterfee sat in the back of his black limousine, reviewing contracts for the Patterson merger that had finally moved forward without the complication of a family wedding. Miranda Patterson had graciously accepted a more suitable arrangement with a senator's son, and the business deal had proceeded smoothly. It should have felt like a victory, but Thomas found it increasingly difficult to feel triumphant about anything these days. "Take Madison Street to the office, Marcus," Thomas instructed his driver, then settled back into the leather seat with his morning newspaper. The business section featured a photograph of him shaking hands with Richard Patterson, announcing the successful completion of their commercial development project. The headline read, "Peterfee Industries secures major partnership." There was no mention of his son. As the limousine crawled through the downtown traffic, Thomas's attention was caught by a commotion on the sidewalk. A small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be a street vendor or salesman, their body language suggesting amusement rather than serious interest. Thomas might have ignored the scene entirely if not for something familiar about the figure at the center of the group, something about the way the man stood, the tilt of his shoulders, the gesture of his hands as he tried to engage potential customers. "Marcus, pull over," Thomas said suddenly, his voice sharp with a tension he couldn't explain. "Sir, just pull over, now." The limousine slid to the curb, and Thomas lowered his window, straining to get a better view of the scene unfolding 50 yards ahead. What he saw made his blood turn to ice in his veins. It was Jensen, his son, his heir, his pride, the boy he had raised to command boardrooms and negotiate million-dollar deals, was standing on a busy street corner wearing a wrinkled white shirt and dark pants, a heavy sample case balanced on one hip, desperately trying to interest passing pedestrians in whatever products he was attempting to sell. "Sir?" Marcus asked, confused by his employer's sudden stillness. Thomas couldn't respond. He was transfixed by the sight of Jensen chasing after a businessman who was walking quickly away, clearly uninterested in whatever Jensen was offering. He watched his son's shoulders slump with rejection before Jensen straightened them with visible effort and approached another potential customer, a woman with shopping bags, who shook her head dismissively and continued walking without breaking stride. This couldn't be real. This had to be some sort of nightmare, some cruel trick of his imagination. The Jensen he knew wore $1,000 suits and commanded respect in every room he entered. The Jensen he knew had never faced rejection in his privileged life, had never had to beg strangers for anything. But as Thomas watched in horror, a group of teenagers began to laugh and point at Jensen, clearly amused by the spectacle of a desperate salesman. One of them said something that made the others laugh harder, and Thomas saw his son's face flush with humiliation. Jensen clutched his sample case closer to his chest and turned away from the group, his dignity crumbling before his father's eyes. "Oh God," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "What have I done?" The full weight of his actions crashed over him like a collapsing building. This was his son, his flesh and blood, the child he had held as a baby, the boy he had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man he had sent to Harvard with such pride. And Thomas had reduced him to this: a desperate street salesman being mocked by teenagers, chasing after strangers who wouldn't even make eye contact. Jensen approached another potential customer, an elderly man who stopped to listen politely. Thomas watched his son's animated gestures, the hopeful expression on his face as he opened his sample case to display whatever products he was selling. For a moment, it looked promising. The man was nodding, asking questions. But then he shook his head apologetically and walked away, leaving Jensen standing alone on the sidewalk, his hope visibly deflating. Thomas's chest tightened with something that felt like a heart attack, but was actually much worse: the crushing realization that he had become the kind of father he had once sworn never to be. His own father had been cold and controlling, more concerned with business than family, and Thomas had promised himself he would be different with his children. Yet here he was, having forced his son into the streets like a common peddler because of his own stubborn pride and obsession with appearances. The worst part was Jensen's determination. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that his son wasn't giving up. After each rejection, Jensen would take a deep breath, adjust his sample case, and approach another potential customer. There was something heartbreaking about his persistence, about the way he refused to surrender despite the obvious humiliation and repeated failures. "Marcus," Thomas said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "how long have we been sitting here?" "About 10 minutes, sir." "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." Thomas realized he was gripping the door handle so tightly his knuckles had turned white. I need to get out for a moment." "Sir, we're in the middle of traffic." "I don't care about the traffic," Thomas snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. Marcus had been his driver for 15 years and didn't deserve his employer's emotional breakdown. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I just need some air." But before Thomas could move, the scene on the sidewalk took an even more devastating turn. A businessman in an expensive suit, someone Thomas recognized as David Morrison from Morrison and Associates, approached Jensen with what appeared to be genuine interest. Thomas watched his son's face light up with hope as he opened his sample case and began his sales pitch. The conversation lasted several minutes, long enough for Thomas to think that maybe, finally, Jensen was going to make a sale. But then Morrison shook his head and started to walk away. Jensen, desperate and clearly at the end of his rope, actually grabbed the man's arm and continued talking, his body language pleading. Morrison turned back with obvious irritation, said something sharp, and pulled his arm free. He walked away quickly, leaving Jensen standing frozen on the sidewalk, his sample case hanging open, his face a mask of complete humiliation. That's when Thomas saw something that broke his heart completely. Jensen looked around to see if anyone had witnessed his desperation, his eyes scanning the crowd with the terrible awareness that he had just degraded himself in public. When Jensen's gaze swept over the limousine, Thomas instinctively sank lower in his seat, afraid of being seen but unable to look away from his son's misery. Jensen closed his sample case with shaking hands, straightened his wrinkled shirt, and walked to a nearby bench. He sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands in a gesture of such complete defeat that Thomas felt physically ill. This was what his ultimatum had accomplished. This was what his business priorities and family pride had created. His son reduced to begging for sales on street corners, while trust fund babies and corporate heirs enjoyed the privileges that should have been Jensen's birthright. Thomas thought about the morning just 2 months ago when Jensen had walked into his office, confident and defiant, choosing love over luxury. Thomas had been so certain that a few weeks of hardship would bring his son crawling back, apologizing and ready to accept the arranged marriage to Miranda. He had told himself he was teaching Jensen a valuable lesson about the real world. Instead, he had destroyed his son's spirit and turned him into this broken figure, sitting alone on a bench, probably wondering how he was going to face the woman he loved after another day of failure and rejection. The irony was suffocating. Thomas had spent his entire career building an empire that was supposed to provide security and opportunity for his family. He had worked 18-hour days, sacrificed friendships, and missed countless family moments to ensure that his children would never have to struggle the way he had in his early marriage to Dorothy. And yet, through his own stubborn pride, he had condemned his son to exactly the kind of hardship he had worked so hard to prevent. "Marcus," Thomas said suddenly, his voice barely controlled, "take me home. Now. What about your 10 o'clock meeting with the investors? Cancel it. Cancel everything for today." As the limousine pulled away from the curb, Thomas couldn't stop looking back at Jensen, still sitting on that bench with his head in his hands. The image burned itself into Thomas's consciousness like a brand, a permanent reminder of what happened when business calculations took precedence over paternal love. The drive to the mansion passed in a blur of guilt and self-recrimination. Thomas had been so focused on protecting the family's business interests and social standing that he had forgotten the most important truth of all. Jensen was his son, not just another business asset to be managed and controlled. By the time the limousine reached the circular drive of the Peterfee estate, Thomas was consumed with an emotional pain unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was worse than any business failure, worse than any financial loss, because this was personal. This was about the deliberate harm he had inflicted on someone he was supposed to protect and nurture. Dorothy met him at the front door, her face creased with worry. "Thomas? You're home early. Marcus called ahead and said you looked ill." "I saw him," Thomas interrupted, his voice cracking with emotion. "I saw Jensen." Dorothy's face went pale. "Where? How is he? Is he—" "He was selling something on the street," Thomas said, the words coming out like broken glass. "Door-to-door sales, Dorothy. Our son was chasing after strangers on Madison Street, begging them to buy whatever he had in that sample case." Dorothy sank into the nearest chair, her hand pressed to her mouth in horror. "Oh my God! Thomas, what have we done?" "What have I done?" Thomas corrected bitterly. "This is my fault. My pride, my stubbornness, my obsession with controlling his life. I turned our son into a street peddler because I couldn't accept that he chose love over money." The full weight of his actions was crushing him now, and Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since he was a child, the desperate need to cry. But successful businessmen didn't cry, especially not billionaire patriarchs who were supposed to be pillars of strength for their families. "We have to fix this," Dorothy said desperately. "We have to call him, apologize, bring him home." "And say what?" Thomas asked harshly. "That I'm sorry for destroying his life? That I'm sorry for blacklisting him with every major employer in the city? That I'm sorry for reducing him to selling products on street corners because my ego couldn't handle the fact that my son valued love more than my business empire?" Dorothy stared at her husband, seeing something in his face she had never seen before, complete emotional breakdown. Thomas Peterfee, who had built a billion-dollar empire through sheer force of will, who had never shown weakness or doubt in 40 years of marriage, was crumbling before her eyes. "Thomas, you're scaring me," she whispered. "I'm scaring myself," he admitted. "Dorothy, I have become everything I swore I would never be. I've become my father, cold, controlling, more concerned with appearance and business than with my children's happiness." The comparison hit both of them like a physical blow. Thomas's father had been a tyrant who had ruled his family with the same iron fist he used to control his business interests. Thomas had spent his entire adult life trying to be different, trying to be the kind of father who supported his children's dreams rather than imposing his own. "That's not true," Dorothy said weakly, but they both knew it was a lie. "Isn't it?" Thomas asked. "I gave Jensen an ultimatum: marry the woman I chose for business reasons or lose everything. How is that different from what my father did to me?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, remembering the early years of their marriage when Thomas's father had tried to pressure him into divorcing her and marrying someone more suitable for the family's social ambitions. Thomas had refused, but it had cost him years of family tension and financial struggles. "The difference," Dorothy said finally, "is that it's not too late to change. Your father never apologized, never admitted he was wrong, but you can." Thomas looked at his wife, this woman who had stood by him through poverty and wealth, through his father's disapproval and his own workaholic tendencies, through 29 years of marriage that had been far from perfect but had been built on genuine love. "What if he won't forgive me?" Thomas asked quietly. "What if I've pushed him too far?" "Then you'll have to earn his forgiveness," Dorothy replied. "However long it takes." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding that the road ahead would be longer and more difficult than any business negotiation he had ever conducted. But as he thought about Jensen sitting alone on that bench, broken and defeated, Thomas knew he had to try. The empire he had built meant nothing if it had cost him his son, and the lesson he was learning too late was one that no business school had ever taught: that some victories weren't worth the price of defeat, and that the most valuable things in life couldn't be controlled, manipulated, or bought. They could only be earned through love, respect, and the courage to admit when you were wrong. As evening fell over the Peterfy mansion, Thomas sat in his study staring at the phone, trying to find the words that might begin to heal the damage his pride had caused. But he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He would have to prove through actions that he had learned the difference between being a successful businessman and being a good father. The question was whether Jensen would give him the chance to try. Chapter 9. Healing Hearts. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected source, and healing begins when pride gives way to grace. The grandfather clock in Thomas Peterfy's study chimed midnight, its deep, resonant tones echoing through the silent mansion like a funeral bell. Thomas sat slumped in his leather chair, still wearing the expensive suit from that morning's abbreviated business day, his usually perfect appearance disheveled and his face grey with exhaustion and guilt. The untouched dinner Dorothy had brought him hours earlier sat cold on his desk, pushed aside to make room for the photographs he had been studying with increasing desperation. Pictures of Jensen through the years covered the mahogany surface. His first day of school, Little League games, high school graduation, college commencement, his first day at Peterfy Industries. In every photograph, Jensen was smiling, bright, genuine smiles that spoke of a happy childhood and a young man who believed the world was full of possibilities. Thomas tried to remember the last time he had seen that smile on his son's face and realized with mounting horror that it had been months, maybe even years. "What kind of father have I been?" Thomas whispered to the empty room, his voice hoarse from hours of silent self-recrimination. The image of Jensen on that street corner played on endless repeat in his mind. The defeated slump of his shoulders, the desperate way he had chased after potential customers, the humiliation on his face when that businessman had rejected him so callously. Thomas had created that scene through his own stubborn pride and business obsessions. He had taken a confident, capable young man and reduced him to a street peddler begging strangers for sales. The irony was suffocating. Thomas had spent his entire adult life building a business empire specifically to ensure that his children would never have to struggle the way he had in his early years with Dorothy. He had worked 18-hour days, missed family dinners, sacrificed vacations and personal relationships, all so that Jensen and Carolyn would inherit a world of security and opportunity. Instead, he had used that very security as a weapon against his own son. Thomas's chest tightened with something that felt like a vice closing around his heart. The stress of the day, combined with months of family tension and the shocking reality of Jensen's situation, was taking a physical toll that his 60-year-old body couldn't handle. He loosened his tie and unbuttoned his collar, trying to ease the pressure, but the pain only intensified. "Dorothy," he called weakly, but his voice was too soft to carry beyond the study walls. The pain spread from his chest down his left arm, and Thomas suddenly understood what was happening. He had seen enough business associates suffer heart attacks to recognize the symptoms, but somehow he had always assumed his own strength and determination would protect him from such mortal weaknesses. Thomas tried to stand, thinking he could make it to the bedroom where Dorothy was sleeping, but his legs wouldn't support him. The room began to spin, and darkness crowded the edges of his vision. His last conscious thought before collapsing was a desperate prayer that he would survive long enough to apologize to his son. Dorothy found him 20 minutes later when she came down to check on him, as she had been doing every hour since his return from witnessing Jensen's humiliation. Thomas was unconscious on the study floor, his face pale and his breathing shallow. The photographs of Jensen were scattered around him like fallen leaves. "Oh God, Thomas!" Dorothy cried, dropping to her knees beside her husband and pressing her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. Years of charity work at various hospitals had taught her basic first aid, and she knew Thomas was having a serious cardiac event. With shaking hands, Dorothy dialed 911, her voice remarkably steady as she provided the necessary information to the dispatcher. Then, as the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, she made another call. To Jensen. She had memorized his number weeks ago, though she had been too proud and too afraid of Thomas's reaction to use it before now. The phone rang 4 times before a sleepy voice answered. "Hello?" "Barbara?" Dorothy said, recognizing the voice from their brief meeting at the mansion. "This is Dorothy Peterfy, Jensen's mother. I'm so sorry to call so late, but—" "Mrs. Peterfy?" Barbara sat up in bed, instantly alert. Beside her, Jensen stirred, awakened by the conversation. "What's wrong?" "It's Thomas," Dorothy said, her composure finally cracking. "He's had a heart attack. They're taking him to St. Mary's Hospital. I know you work there, and I know we don't deserve your help after how we treated you, but—" "Which unit are they bringing him to?" Barbara interrupted, already climbing out of bed and reaching for her clothes. "Emergency, I think. The paramedic said—" "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Barbara said firmly. "Mrs. Peterfy, try to stay calm. St. Mary's has an excellent cardiac unit, and I'll make sure he gets the best possible care." Jensen was fully awake now, confused and alarmed by the one-sided conversation he had heard. "What's happening?" "Your father's had a heart attack," Barbara said, pulling on her scrubs with practiced efficiency. "They're bringing him to my hospital." Jensen's face went white. Despite everything that had happened between them, Thomas was still his father, the man who had taught him to ride a bicycle, who had attended every Little League game, who had been so proud when Jensen graduated from Harvard. Whatever anger and hurt existed between them couldn't erase 29 years of love. "I have to go to him," Jensen said, reaching for his clothes. "Of course you do," Barbara agreed, kissing him quickly. "I'll meet you there." "And Jensen, whatever happened between you and your father, focus on what matters now. Focus on the fact that you love each other." The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital was in controlled chaos when the ambulance arrived with Thomas Peterfy. Barbara had already alerted the cardiac team and prepared the trauma bay, drawing on her 6 years of experience to ensure everything was ready for a serious heart attack case. "What do we have?" Dr. Martinez asked as the paramedics wheeled Thomas through the automatic doors. "Male patient, possible myocardial infarction," the lead paramedic reported. "Lost consciousness at home. Wife found him 20 minutes later. Vitals are unstable. BP dropping. Irregular heartbeat." As they transferred Thomas to the hospital gurney, Barbara got her first close look at Jensen's father since their confrontation at the mansion. The powerful, intimidating businessman who had dismissed her so coldly was gone, replaced by a vulnerable older man whose face was grey with pain and whose expensive suit was wrinkled and disheveled. "Get him to cardiac ICU, doctor," Martinez ordered. "We need an EKG, chest X-ray and blood work stat." Barbara found herself taking charge of Thomas's care with the same professional competence she brought to every patient, regardless of personal feelings. She attached monitoring equipment, started an IV line, and began documenting his vital signs, her hands steady and sure despite the emotional turmoil of treating the man who had nearly destroyed her happiness. "How is he?" Dorothy asked anxiously as she hurried into the cardiac unit, still wearing her nightgown under a hastily thrown-on coat. "He's stable for now," Barbara replied gently. Dr. Martinez is reviewing his tests, but it appears he's had a significant cardiac episode. We're doing everything we can." Jensen arrived just as the cardiac team was wheeling Thomas into the intensive care unit. He looked haggard and frightened, still wearing the wrinkled clothes he had worn during his day of unsuccessful sales attempts. Father and son hadn't spoken in 2 months, but seeing Thomas unconscious and connected to monitors and machines put everything else into perspective. "Is he going to be okay?" Jensen asked, his voice breaking slightly. Barbara squeezed his hand reassuringly. "He's in good hands. Dr. Martinez is one of the best cardiologists in the state." As the hours passed, the Peterfy family kept vigil in the cardiac waiting room. Carolyn arrived shortly after dawn, having driven through the night from her apartment across town. The family that had been fractured by pride and stubbornness was brought together again by the universal language of fear and love. "I should have called him," Jensen said repeatedly, pacing the small waiting room. "I should have tried to work things out instead of being so stubborn." "You weren't the stubborn one," Dorothy said quietly. "Your father created this situation. He pushed you away because he couldn't accept that you had grown into your own man with your own dreams." Barbara watched the family dynamics with professional detachment and personal compassion. She had seen this scenario countless times, families torn apart by petty disagreements and wounded pride, only to realize how precious their relationships were when faced with the possibility of permanent loss. At 10 o'clock that morning, Dr. Martinez emerged from the ICU with news. "He's awake," he announced, bringing visible relief to the anxious family. "It was a significant heart attack and he'll need several weeks of recovery, but he's going to be fine." "Can we see him?" Dorothy asked anxiously. "One at a time, and only for a few minutes, Doctor," Martinez cautioned. "He's still very weak." Dorothy went first, emerging from Thomas's room 20 minutes later with tears streaming down her face. "He wants to see Jensen," she said simply. Jensen hesitated at the doorway of his father's room, suddenly unsure of what to say to the man who had disowned him just 2 months earlier. Thomas looked smaller somehow, diminished by the hospital bed and medical equipment, his usually commanding presence reduced to that of a tired, aging man who had finally realized the cost of his pride. "Jensen," Thomas said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Son, I'm so sorry." Jensen approached the bed slowly, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Dad, don't try to talk. You need to rest." "No," Thomas interrupted with surprising firmness. "I need to say this while I still can. I saw you today, Jensen, on Madison Street. I saw what I had done to you." Jensen's face flushed with embarrassment and shame. "Dad, you were chasing after strangers, begging them to buy whatever you were selling," Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength from urgent need. "My son, my brilliant, capable son, reduced to street sales because of my stubborn pride. I destroyed your life because I couldn't accept that you chose love over money." "It wasn't destroyed," Jensen said quietly. "It was just different than planned." Thomas reached out with a trembling hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Jensen took it. "I became everything I swore I would never be," Thomas said, tears sliding down his cheeks. "I became my father, cold, controlling, more concerned with business than with your happiness." "Dad, you're not—" "Yes, I am," Thomas said firmly, "but I want to change that. If you'll let me, if you can forgive a foolish old man who almost lost the most important thing in his life because he couldn't see past his own expectations." Jensen felt his own tears beginning to fall. "Of course I forgive you, Dad. You're my father. I love you. And I love you, son. More than any business deal, more than any amount of money, more than my own pride." Thomas squeezed Jensen's hand with surprising strength. "I want to meet her properly this time, Barbara. I want to apologize to the woman you love and welcome her into this family the way I should have from the beginning." "She's here," Jensen said softly. "She's been taking care of you all night." "She saved your life, Dad." Thomas's eyes widened in amazement. "She's been after how I treated her." "That's who she is," Jensen said with quiet pride. "She saves people, even people who don't deserve it." 20 minutes later, Barbara entered Thomas's room with some trepidation. She had treated him as a patient with professional competence, but facing him as Jensen's father, and as the man who had nearly destroyed their happiness, was an entirely different challenge. "Miss Williams," Thomas said as she approached his bed, "Barbara, I owe you an apology that I can never adequately express." Barbara was quiet for a moment, studying the man who had wielded so much power over their lives just hours earlier. In the hospital bed, connected to monitors and dependent on medical care, he looked nothing like the intimidating patriarch who had issued ultimatums and threatened to destroy his son's future. "Mr. Peterfy," she said finally, "you don't owe me anything. You were protecting your family the only way you knew how." "I was protecting my business interests," Thomas corrected with brutal honesty. "I was willing to sacrifice my son's happiness to maintain relationships that don't matter nearly as much as I thought they did." Barbara moved closer to check his monitors, her professional instincts taking over. "Your vital signs are improving. The medication is working well." "Barbara," Thomas said softly, "I need you to know something. I watched Jensen today, and I saw a man who was willing to do anything, even humiliate himself, to build a life with the woman he loves. I've spent 40 years in business, and I've never seen that kind of dedication or courage." Barbara felt tears threatening but maintained her professional composure. "He loves you too, Mr. Peterfy. This separation has been as hard on him as it has been on you." "Will you forgive me?" Thomas asked suddenly, his voice breaking. "Will you forgive an old fool who nearly destroyed the best thing that ever happened to his son?" Barbara looked at this powerful man, who had been brought low by his own pride and nearly killed by the stress of realizing his mistakes. She thought about Jensen's love for his family, about the little boy who had cried for months after leaving his childhood sweetheart, about the man who had chosen love over luxury despite the cost. "There's nothing to forgive," Barbara said gently. "You're Jensen's father, and you love him. Sometimes love makes us do things that seem wrong, but come from the right place." Thomas closed his eyes, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. "I want to make this right. The job situation, the money, everything. I want my son back, and I want to welcome you into this family properly." "We don't need the money," Barbara said firmly. "We never did. We just needed your acceptance and your love." "You have both," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "You saved my life tonight, Barbara. In more ways than one." As Barbara left Thomas's room, she found Jensen waiting in the hallway with Dorothy and Carolyn. The family looked exhausted but hopeful, like people who had survived a terrible storm and were finally seeing sunlight breaking through the clouds. "How is he?" Jensen asked. "He's going to be fine," Barbara said, smiling through her tears. "And I think your family's going to be fine too." Jensen pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the weight of months of stress and uncertainty finally began to lift. They had chosen love over luxury, struggled through rejection and hardship, and emerged stronger for the trials they had faced. But their greatest test was behind them now, and their future, with family love and acceptance, stretched ahead like a golden road leading to everything they had ever dreamed of together. Chapter 10. New Beginnings. In the end, love conquers all, transforming hearts, healing wounds, and creating miracles that money could never buy. 3 months later, the late spring gardens of the Peterfy estate were transformed into a fairy tale setting. White roses cascaded from every surface, and an elegant pavilion had been erected near the old oak tree, where Jensen and Barbara had once promised to love each other forever as children. In the mansion's master bedroom, Barbara stood before an antique mirror while Dorothy and Carolyn helped with her wedding dress. Dorothy's own gown, altered to fit Barbara perfectly. The silk and lace seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. "You look absolutely radiant," Dorothy said, her relationship with Barbara having blossomed during Thomas's recovery. "Jensen has been smiling non-stop for weeks." Barbara marveled at how different her life had become since that night in the hospital emergency room when Jensen had walked back into her world. The struggles they had faced had only strengthened their bond and proven that their childhood love could survive anything. A soft knock interrupted their preparations. Thomas entered, moving carefully but with obvious joy. His eyes filled with tears when he saw Barbara in her wedding dress, this woman who had saved his life and restored his son's happiness. "Barbara," he said softly, "you look absolutely beautiful." "I was hoping you might allow me the honor of walking you down the aisle," he continued, producing a small velvet box. "And I'd like you to wear this, your mother's pearl necklace. I found it and thought someday I might have a daughter-in-law who would appreciate its significance." Barbara's eyes filled with tears as Thomas fastened the necklace around her neck. She felt the presence of her parents blessing this moment and this new family, welcoming her with such love. The ceremony was simple but profound, officiated by the hospital chaplain. They had written their own vows that spoke of childhood promises kept and love tested and proven true. "Jensen," Barbara said, her voice clear despite her tears, "you were my first love, my only love, my forever love. I vow to love you through all the ordinary moments and all the extraordinary ones for all the days of my life." "Barbara," Jensen replied, his voice breaking with emotion, "you taught me that love is the only wealth worth pursuing. I promise to spend every day proving myself worthy of the love you've given me." When the chaplain pronounced them husband and wife, Jensen's kiss was gentle and reverent. The guests erupted in applause, but the newlyweds only had eyes for each other. The reception was held under stars, with dancing and laughter echoing through the gardens. As the evening wound down, the Peterfy family gathered around a table. Dorothy sat beside her husband, one hand resting on his arm in a gesture of support and love that had sustained them through decades of marriage. "I want to say something," Barbara announced, standing with a champagne glass in her hand. "This has been the most perfect day of my life, made even more special by being welcomed into this wonderful family." "The pleasure has been entirely ours," Thomas said warmly. "You've brought our son home to us in every way that matters." "Actually," Barbara said, her smile becoming even brighter, "there's something else I want to share with all of you." Jensen looked at his new wife curiously. Barbara reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers as she had done countless times as a child. "Jensen and I are going to have a baby." The silence lasted exactly 3 heartbeats before the table erupted in joyful chaos. Dorothy gasped, Carolyn shrieked with delight, and Jensen stared at his wife in amazement. But it was Thomas's reaction that would be remembered forever. The powerful businessman simply put his head in his hands and wept, great, gasping sobs of pure joy. "I'm going to be a grandfather," Thomas said through his tears. "After everything I almost lost, I'm going to be a grandfather." "The baby's due in early spring," Barbara said softly, "just after our first anniversary." Jensen pulled his wife into his arms carefully, mindful of the precious life they had created together. "Are you happy?" Barbara asked. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Jensen replied, cupping her face in his hands. "Grateful, amazed, overwhelmed, all of those and more." As the family celebrated, Thomas sat quietly, watching his son and daughter-in-law with eyes bright with tears. The heart attack that had nearly killed him had given him the greatest gift, the chance to see what really mattered and rebuild the relationships that made life worth living. "Thank you," he whispered to Barbara. "Thank you for loving my son, for saving my life, for giving our family a second chance." "Thank you for raising the man I fell in love with," Barbara replied, squeezing his hand. Later, Jensen and Barbara walked hand in hand to the old oak tree where it had all begun. "Do you remember what you told me under this tree when we were 9? Barbara asked. "I told you I was going to marry you and we'd live happily ever after," Jensen replied, pulling her close. "And did we?" Barbara asked with a smile. Jensen looked at his wife, this woman who had kept their childhood drawing for 20 years, who was now carrying their child, and felt his heart overflow with complete happiness. "We're just getting started," he said, kissing her under the same tree where they had made their first promises. "But yes, my love, we absolutely did." Above them, the stars blessed a family that had learned the most important lesson, that love is the only treasure worth pursuing. And in November, when their first child was born, that lesson would begin again with fresh hope and infinite possibility.